We're back. In this video, we are going to review integers. For this video, I'm just going to need to remind you of some key properties of integers and then just kind of discuss the problems with you. I'm not necessarily going to be able to go through the problems with you because then I'll just be doing them, but I do think watching the video is going to be extremely helpful in this case. So we are starting with the idea on page 8, which is where we talk about combining integers. So that's where we're starting at. We're going to look at what happens when we combine integers. So I have 3 different situations that I want to go over with you guys. We are going to look at what happens when we do -10 plus 6. Then we're going to look at what happens when we change the signs. So we make 10 positive and the 6 negative. And then we're going to look at one last situation where we have a positive 6 and a negative 6. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because this is a review and we've reviewed it quite a few times this year. If I want to combine -10 and positive 6, I start by putting 10 dots on the negative side, and then I add 6 more dots to the positive side. And I have them lined up here because what happens is for every one positive you have, it cancels out a negative. So all of these guys lined up in the middle cancel out. And if I combine a -10 and a positive 6, what I end up getting is -4. It's slightly different though when the 10 is positive. So I put 10 on the positive side, 6 on the negative side. I cancel out once again, but this time my leftovers are on the positive side. I don't have to write the positive on here because we just assume all numbers are positive. So if you look at the back wall where the clock is above our stars, you can see that our poster on the left-hand side of the clock says that there's a positive symbol in front of every number. We don't have to write it, it's invisible math. And then the last one I wanted to look at is what happens if we put 6 on the negative, 6 on the positive, we cross those out, and we end up getting 0. We end up getting 0. So it turns out, and what we need to remember is that when we combine integers, if we have more negatives when we combine them, our answer will be negative. If we have more positives when we combine them, our answer will be positive. And if we have the same amount of each, they're just going to cancel out to 0. In fact, these guys are special. These 2 numbers are special. We call these opposites or additive inverses. Additive inverses. So you're going to see a couple of questions where it asks you about additive inverses. Additive inverses are opposites, so they're the same number, but one's positive and one is negative. And you can see that on page 15. We did one little brief portion of our notes on additive inverses. So notice here, same number, one positive, one negative. The reason that they're called additive inverses is because when you add them, they go to 0. So we want to be careful that we know that additive inverses, same number, different sign. And then with combining more positives, you get a positive answer, more negatives, you get a negative answer. This is now related to question 1 on your integers review quiz. So question 1 says, which 2 numbers, when you add them together, will be negative? So you are selecting the combination where you have more negatives than positives. Question 2 is a multiply one. It says, which two numbers, when you multiply them, will have a positive product? Now, this goes back to page 14, I believe, in our notebook, and we have to review the rules where if you combine a positive and a positive, so I shouldn't say combine, if you multiply a positive and a positive, the answer stays positive. If you multiply a negative and a negative, they turn positive. And if you mix the signs, if you have one positive, one negative, that's the only way where you get a negative. It's like the negative wins. So if they're the same sign, it's always positive. If you mix a positive and a negative, your answer is negative. So you need that knowledge in order for you to be able to answer question 2. Which two numbers, when multiplied, will give you a positive product? If you need to, go through and multiply each pair. 0 times 2, 0 times negative 5, 0 times negative 4, 2 times negative 5, 2 times negative 4, 5, negative 4 times negative 5. Like, you can practice or you know the rules. Question 3 and 4 have to do with additive inverses. So this is saying if you add two numbers and they equal 0, and you know one of them is negative 8, what is the other one? This one is saying which two are additive inverses. That means which two, when you add them, will equal 0. Our last question is a little bit more complicated. So this is another kind of additive inverse, knowing how you cancel out all the numbers problem. So this one says you are trying to make 0 and you have the number 13. Select all that will result in 0. So this first one says you add 13. What they mean to that is you take this 13 and you add to it 13. Will that give you 0? No. That gives you 26. Then it comes down here and says, what happens if you subtract a negative 13? You would literally put into your calculator 13 subtract negative 13. You would have subtract then a negative, so a negative negative. So you would go through and check all these. Now remember, the additive inverse of negative 13 is positive 13. So they're saying you add the additive inverse of negative 13. That means you add 13. Down here where it says you add the additive inverse of 13, well, that means you add the additive inverse, which means you're adding negative 13. So whenever you see additive inverse, think opposite. What happens if you add the opposite of negative 13 to 13? What happens when you add the opposite of 13 to 13? So the add and subtract should be pretty straightforward, but the additive inverse is complicated. So just take your time and be careful on that one. That's it for our integer review. Obviously, we'll practice a lot more before your RISE quiz, but hopefully this was enough to help you through it. Okay, love you guys.